Picking up where I left off, I now want to make the macro that will show all the remaining collabs, and I also want the relevant information from these other columns, which means I need to do what's essentially an anti-join. I want to take all of the collabs from this column and then remove the ones that can be found over here. But VBA doesn't have that innately, so I need to make it myself. I want to start out by loading these two columns into an array to make it faster to loop. I then want to store the remaining collabs inside of another array. I want to have a count of how many collabs I still need to unlock. And then because I'll need to loop through actually twice, I want to have a helper variable that will simply say if I can find this collab inside of this column. And then I need multiple looper variables. And lastly, I want a message so that instead of creating a big message as I've done before, I want to do as I've done up here and create a variable that stores it. And this will make more sense because I need to loop many times and change this variable many times. So this is simply equal to then my tbill unlocked, specifically the column unlock collabs. And likewise, all collabs is then equal to this table, specifically the collab column. And I want to have a count of remaining collabs, which is going to be the length of all collabs minus the length of unlock collabs. So I can say ubound of all collabs, comma 1, minus the upper bound of unlock collabs, comma 1. And if I just run this so we can see it, because this should then be, I have 23 collabs and it should then be 21. So if I just run this, I'll see 21. I can then define my helper variable already unlocked, which will start out with being false. And I want my message to start out with remaining collabs and then some line breaks. And then I want to loop through. It doesn't matter if I loop through all collabs and then afterwards into the unlocked or vice versa. So I'm choosing to loop through the unlocked collabs first. Looper unlocked equals to want to upper bound of my unlocked collabs. I then want to compare the value, but I need to loop through all the collabs. So I then have to loop through my all collabs. In here, then I simply want to compare the values, and in case I can find this value inside this column, then I want to say that it's true and I've already unlocked this collab. Meaning I'll simply say if all collabs, comma looper all 1 is equal to unlock collabs, which is then the looper unlocked, comma 1, then I want to set already unlocked to be equal to true, which will then count as my flag. Actually, I can see that it would make more sense to swap these around. So I'm looping through so that my inner loop is the unlocked and the outer loop is looper all. Because what I'm actually doing is I'm saying, can I find absolute wall within this? Yes, I can. Can I find BL Fujoshi inside this column? No, I can't. So I actually should do this method, meaning I should loop through the whole collab first. This is the column where I don't necessarily have a match over here. But if I start from here, then I will guaranteed have a match. Meaning at this point, I've already checked if I can find this collab inside of this column. And if so, I set the flag already unlocked to be true, which means I can now check if already unlocked is true. Then I actually don't want to do anything. And again, I don't strictly speaking have to do this. I just choose to do it because I think it will be more legible. I've now confirmed that the given collab hasn't been unlocked, which means I want to fill it up inside of my... Actually, I can see that I don't even need to use this. I don't need to store the collab that can be found in the unlock table because I'll simply put that information inside the message. So that is a pointless array. Instead, I now want to say that I've now confirmed that my given collab is a remaining collab, which means I can now manipulate the message. I want to say that message should be equal to itself and then a line break. I can also see that I won't need this count of remaining collabs. I thought I would need this in order to redim my array, but I've decided to remove that, so I don't need it. I don't need that anymore. Meaning here I have my message, and I then want to grab the collab name, which I have from my array, which I can't find in my array right now. So I need to find the starting cell inside of this table. And what I can do actually is that here, instead of saying all collabs, that should be specifically one column. I can actually say I want to load the entire table inside, because this means that when I'm in the first row, I have access to the other columns because they're stored together in one array. So if I just comment this out just to show what I mean, I can say that now inside unlock collabs, I only have the one value, but inside all collabs, I now have 5 values, which makes it a lot easier actually. Meaning I want my message to still be equal to itself, And then I can say that I want to grab the first value from all collabs. So this portion. And now the trouble is that I don't have access to the column headers, which means that if you were to change the order around, it would break. But you shouldn't do that. Then I'm going to use the VB tab character, which is just a tab like normal. Because if I have a line break, I don't have enough room, as we saw before, where a message box can only have so many characters. And then I want to grab this again, but this time I want the second. So now I have collab and weapon 1, and I can repeat this. And since I'm adding a line break up here before I load the new collab, I don't need to add a line break at the end. And then right here at the bottom, at the end of the if, I want to set already unlocked back to be false. And then that should actually be everything. I simply need to print my message box subscribe auto range. So that's great. That's because I forgot to swap this around. So this should be that. That was my mistake for messing up the order of which column to loop through first. And then I guess this is still the same. So I was actually right the first time around. I'll say beautiful Joshi, Bone Bros, breathe in type Asakoko. So this is everything. And then I think I have the same problem as before, that I get down to Frozen Sea. That's fine. Then I get to I'm die, thank you forever, which can be printed. But that's a limitation of VBA and not something I can solve unless I want to print a new sheet, which I would rather avoid. I can now move on to the next macro, which will be showing all weapons with remaining collabs, which I will call weapons with remaining. This is going to be the longest macro, where I have to start out first by doing what I did above and show all remaining collabs and do an exclusive join. So I only want those collabs that I can't find over here, which would then be all of these, 21. And then I want to look at the weapons and say, which weapons do I have the most collabs remaining to unlock? Which means I actually need to do all of this again, basically, and then only look at the weapon. I can start out with saying I need a remaining collabs. So I'm going to cheat and copy over my variables just to make it a bit faster and easier for me. I again want to load all of my remaining collabs, which means I first need the unlock collabs and all collabs. And then I want to do a weapon grouping array, and then I need to sort it. Because unfortunately, VBA doesn't have a basic .sort function like Python and pandas. So I need to first group all of my weapons, and then I need to sort them afterwards. And again, as above, I want an already unlocked helper variable and an already in list helper variable. And then this was the one I didn't need. And then I'm sure I'll end up removing some of these. So just as before, I can go up and copy this part because I need access to the weapon 1 and weapon 2 column from all collabs. And this time I do want to have this remaining collabs array because I do need it now. And I don't want to just store a message because I actually need to work upon the collabs I have remaining to unlock. And since I have weapons in both column 1 and 2, so I don't have a table that's twice as long where I can find all weapons in one column, I need to make it be twice as long because I want weapon 1 and weapon 2 to be sort of transposed to be one column. So I want to say that this should then be actually redimmed because I'm changing the dimensions of the array. So it should go from 1 to 2 times, and then I want that in parentheses. And this is why I could use that count of remaining collabs as a variable, but I'm just doing it in one go. And I want that minus the upper bound of unlock collabs. And it's probably overkill to store these two as the arrays, but I'm doing it to be consistent. And then I need 2 columns because I need both the weapon name and the count. I don't need that equal sign. And I have 1, 2, like so. And I guess it doesn't want me to have extra spaces, but that's whatever. So this is now twice as long as the difference between these two, because again, I need 2 rows for each collab because I have 2 weapons. And then I want this array row, which is going to help me later. At this point, I have to do basically the same thing I did up here. So if I was looking ahead, I could have turned this into a function that I then call from 2 macros, but I'm not doing that. I want to say that I want to loop from 1 to the upper bound of all collabs. And again, it's important that I do it in this order because I want to basically remove any collab that I can find in this table. So I don't want absolute wall or broken dreams. And again, I'm using this already unlocked as a helper, but this time I'm just putting it at the start because it really doesn't matter. And then looping through all of my unlocks. And just as before, I want to say if all collabs looper all, comma 1 is then equal to my unlock collabs, looper unlocked, comma 1. Then I want to set already unlocked to be true. And I'm doing the if sentence in one line because then I don't need that then a line and then end if. which means I can then check if already unlocked is equal to true, then do nothing. I then want to add it to my array, which is then the remaining collabs. So I'll say remaining collabs, and this is where I use array row. So in the first column, I want the name of the weapon, which I then get from my all collabs array. And then I can copy this and say now I want it from the second. And this is then going to be looper all collabs, but the second column, which is then weapon 1. And then I need to repeat this, but this time I want it to be an array row plus 1 because it's the next row. It should then be column 3 because that's weapon 2. And then I increase array row to be equal to itself plus 2. I could increase array row here and then do it here too, but I think that's kind of pointless to do unless you really want to get rid of this array row plus 1. But I think this makes more sense. And at this point I can try running it so that we can see what's actually going on. So I now have my remaining collabs, which is then Beal for Josie, Beal Book, Beal for Josie Psychoax, and I can go all the way down and see Stream of Tears, CO Tears, Stream of Tears, Fan Beam. So that's exactly what I expected, but it hasn't been grouped yet and it hasn't been sorted yet, which is then the next thing to do. At this point, I can now create my next array, which is going to be the weapon grouping. And here I don't want to have the 42 rows I had up here. I only want one row for each weapon. So I'm going to start out by saying that array row should now be equal to 1. And then I'm going to redim my weapon grouping array to be from 1 to 2 because I want the name and the count. And then I can say 1 to array row, which in this case is just going to be 1. Because I then need to redim the array, which means adding an extra row every time I find a weapon that I haven't added to my list, which is why I need this helper variable. And redimming an array many times, which is what I'm doing here, is generally terrible for performance. So I could also create a new array with an amount of rows equal to what I get up here in this array, and then create another array where I only add however many rows I have weapons for. But because I have such a small data set, I think this is going to be okay to redimming it, because what VBA actually does is when you redim, it creates a new array and then it copy pastes the values from the original array into the new one. So if you have 1,000,000 rows and you redim 1,000,000 times, that's going to cost a lot. But when I have 23 rows, I think I can live with that. This project is never going to run into performance issues. So at this point, I have a 2, 1 dimensional array, and I want to then again loop through all my collabs from 1 to upper bound of my remaining collabs, 1. And then I'm saying that already in list should then be equal to false. So just as up here, this is basically the same thing, except I'm now moving weapons from this array into this array. So it's basically the same principle. And I'm just reusing these looper variables. And again, I'm saying if my remaining collabs, and this is then the weapon 1 column, and then weapon grouping, its first column is going to be the name. The benefit of what I did up here, where I duplicated the rows, so I have one column with the collab name and one column with a weapon, is that I only have to do this comparison in this one line. Whereas if I hadn't done what I've done, I would have 2 columns to compare. So this is a bit easier. But as before, I can then say if already in list is equal to true, then I want to do nothing. Otherwise, I want to actually do something. I first want to check if I'm in my first row. Here I'll simply say that weapon grouping 1, 1 should then be equal to remaining collab, looper, all collabs, 2, meaning the name of the weapon. And then the count will then be equal to 1. If I'm not adding my first weapon, so if I haven't already added the weapon I then want to, so I'll say that weapon grouping column 1, array row is then equal to remaining collabs, looper all columns, 2, which is then the name of weapon. And then weapon grouping, the second column, is then equal to 1. And at the end of that, I then want to increase array row to be equal to itself plus 1. And actually I want to swap this around because here I do want to check first if it's false, because I actually need to do something if it's true. So that was just me thinking I had to copy paste a lot more than I did, but I don't. If I'm adding a weapon for the first time, and if I've already added the weapon, then I need to increase the count. I then want to add an extra column to my array. I want to redim, but I also want to preserve the current items inside the array. So say I still want 1 to 2, and then I want 1 to array row. And I've already increased array row just before, so I add an extra column. Actually here I want to check if it's false, because I do actually need to do something. If already in list is false, then I'm adding the weapon. So this should actually be inside of the if, and then I'm saying else. And in this case, I need to increase the count because I've already added it to my array. which means I need to find the correct position, that is the correct row, inside of my weapon grouping array so I can increase the count, which means I need to loop again. So I'll just reuse looper unlock collab, say 1 to array row, and in case then my remaining collabs, looper all, which is the one I'm currently looping through, comma 2. If that's weapon name is then equal to weapon grouping in the first column, looper unlocked, then I want to increase the count. So weapon grouping, the second column, looper unlock collabs, that should then be equal to 1 plus weapon grouping 2, comma, looper unlock collabs. Then we can try running this to say weapon grouping should then have BLBook, blah, 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 blah. And that should then be 2 and 2. And then I have probably whammy water and sausage at the end, which I can then check. That would be C sausage and C ostias. So I have an extra row at the end, which I don't want, but that's because I'm preserving here. So I'm adding an extra row, which I don't want to. Or maybe actually I'm starting with one. So if I just do like this, my weapon grouping then has an empty first row. And then I add BLBook and a count of 1. And then it adds an extra row here in Redim preserve. So what I can do is that at the end, I want to remove that last row. So I can say Redim preserved my weapon grouping, and it should still be 1 to 2, but it should be 1 to array row minus 1. And if I then run it, I should now not have that extra row at the end. Yeah. But now I need to sort it because if we go back and check, I have here 3, 3, 2, 3, 3, and I want them to go 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, then 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, then 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And 0 won't be added because they aren't in my, they wouldn't be in my remaining collabs because they've been removed here. I now have my weapon grouping array filled up, but I want to sort it again on the second column. And I want to do that inside of a function just to keep things separated because this is already way too long. I want to create a function which will do my sort at 2-dimensional array, which I can see down here. And I want that to take an argument, which will be my original array, as variant. And when I then up here call it, I want my weapon grouping array to be equal to the output of this function. And it then takes weapon grouping as its argument. So this is like what I did in pandas, where my variable is equal to a function that takes the variable as its argument, which I think is funny. I can then write everything down here. I need a temporary array because again, as I explained earlier, you can't easily change an array. It's better performance-wise to create another array and then fill that one up, because if you do a redim preserve many times, that would be bad for performance. So I don't have to have a temporary array. I could also do this redim preserve and then check if a value is greater. So when I find a 2, I need to move that down and replace it with the next row and then keep going. But I'd rather do it with a temporary array. And then I need several loopers, and I'm using an integer because this allows reverse looping. And these will make sense in a moment. Because I need to change the position of the weapons, I need to temporarily store first the original weapon with the new weapon so they can swap places. And that will make sense in a moment. So max columns is going to be the upper bound of my original array, comma 2. And in this case, I have 3 groupings. I can either have 3, 2, or 1 collabs remaining. And I then want to redim my temporary array to be equal to 1 to the upper bound of original array, comma 1. And then from 1 to max columns. And then a parentheses. And I can actually already, just to showcase what's going on. Yeah, because I forgot to have the actual output. So my output of sort 2D array is then going to be my temp array. Because I know I only have these 3 groupings, I can then say I want to do my outer loop to be equal to 3, 2, 1, and then say step minus 1, so go backwards. And then here I can then again say looper inner should be equal to 1 to max columns. And then here I can simply say if my original array 2, looper inner, if that's then equal to the value of looper outer, then I want to add it. Then column count should be equal to itself plus 1. And I want temp array 1, column count to be equal to my original array 1, looper inner. And then I can copy that because I also want to copy the second value. And I can see I figured out why something wasn't working. I'm trying to say the weapon grouping should be equal to sorted weapon grouping, which was an array up here. And I'm not calling the function, so that kind of makes sense. Sort 2D array, so I can now show that weapon grouping is now equal to this output. So actually I should do that a bit slower and go down here. So now I have my sort 2D array. So the function should be equal to the temp array, and temp array is now blbook psychox blah 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 blah. And we can see 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. And then I don't have any weapons with 1 collab remaining. But it's now been sorted, but it's been sorted based on the count. And I also want to sort them based on letter. So right now I have B, P, E, and H. And I want that to be A first, then B, then C, and so on. So I've only sorted on one dimension, and I want to sort first on the count, that is the second column, and then I want to sort alphabetically on the first column. So I'm only halfway done, basically. So I repeat another loop, my looper outer is equal from 1 to max columns, and then again I can say looper inner is equal to looper outer to max columns. And unfortunately this isn't something I came up with myself, at least not the template. So I can say here, want to sort alphabetically on column 1. And I got that from this page, how to alphabetically sort an array. And then I've changed it to work on a 2-dimensional array, which the answer doesn't show here. Then I can say if temp array in the second column, so this could be 3, 2, or 1, if that's different from my temp array, 2, looper inner, because I'm now actually doing 2 loops over the same array, because, and this is a bit tricky to explain, but I'll show it once the function is done. What I'm doing here is I'm actually doing 2 loops, to no one's surprise, and I need to compare the outer loop, so the first row, to then the second row and to the third row and so on. And I want to say here, if their second value is different, then I want to break the loop, because that means right now I have 3 collabs remaining to unlock, then 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. And the moment I then hit 2, I want to break prematurely. So I can say then exit 4. So break the loop when eg3 becomes 2, because then I don't want to compare them. And if this check is incorrect, then I can say if temp array 1, looper inner, if that is smaller than my temp array 1, looper outer, then I want to swap them around. I'm comparing their letter value. And if the inner is then smaller than outer, that means this could be BL book and this could be psychoax, then I want to swap places. And I forgot a parenthesis. Then I want to say temp weapon 1 should be equal to the temp array 1, looper inner. And this is where it can be a bit tricky to keep a hold of them. Then that should be temp array 1, looper outer. And then I swap the values around. And I don't have to care about the second column because that's the same, because I checked for that up here. Meaning I can say temp array 1, looper outer should be equal to then temp weapon 1. And likewise temp array 1, looper inner should then be equal to temp weapon 2. So now they've swapped places. And I think I forgot to say that the reason why here in my looper inner I'm saying looper outer to max columns, that's because when this inner loop is done, I've swapped around places, which means I know that the first looper outer, that is the first row in my array, that's been sorted correctly. And that means there's no point in checking it again, because that's just that's going to repeat this over and over again. So I can cut out many loops. But at that point, it will then be sorted both in terms of the value, the second column, and in terms of the first value, which will then be alphabetically. And then I can say sort to the array, which is my function name, is equal to temp array. And then I go back up here to weapon grouping. So if everything is fine, I go down here, weapon grouping, which hasn't been grouped because again, I have the 3, 3, 2. I then go into the function and I can now see my temp array has been sorted. BL book, Ian's curse, elite lava bucket, and then it goes 3, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So whammy waters all the way at the end, which is exactly what I expect. And my array has now been sorted, but of course I'm still not done because I still need to actually print my message. So that was only one part of it, but luckily it's the biggest part, which means I can now say that my group string should be equal to empty. And then I can say I then want to print my array, which is then weapon grouping this time. And I want both columns in one row inside of my message box. So I can say another loop or looper all collabs equal to 1 to the upper bound of weapon grouping, comma 2. If looper all columns is equal to 1, meaning I'm in my first loop, then I want to say the group string should be equal to weapon grouping 1, looper all and a space, and then weapon grouping the second column, looper all collab, and then else. So this is my first grouping. Then I want to do a line break. And actually, I guess I don't really need to do that because I can instead say I just want to check something and then I'll leave this be and I can remove it afterwards. And then if I end up needing it, I can just add it again. So instead I'm saying group string be equal to itself. And then it should also be equal to weapon grouping. And actually, I'm just going to copy that. And then I want a line break at the end. And then, of course, this is going to leave me with an extra line break all the way at the end, which I can show really quick because then I'm actually done here. Don't need that anymore. I get, actually, I guess I don't. At least I can't see the line break, so I'm going to assume it doesn't really matter. So this part was actually easier than I expected. I don't need this. So that's very, very nice. I'm basically just filling up the group string. So if I can find that, if I just say group string, which is currently nothing, and then when I go through one loop, that was not what I wanted to do. So group string is now equal to blbook, and then I repeat the loop, and there's now blbook and enskurs, and I repeat, and I now get more. So yeah, and I just want to show if I do get that extra line break at the end, which I do, but it doesn't really matter. It's not clearly visible here, so I'll leave it in, which means this macro is actually also done. Unfortunately, that was the biggest macro, and I have 2 easy macros left over before I get to adding and removing collabs, which is quite big. The next 2 are going to be easy, simply showing the name of all collabs, which is just grabbing this column. And then the next one will be show name of all weapons, which is these 2, but then I need to delete duplicates. So show name of all collabs means I need to go back here and decide what I want to call the macro. And it would really help if I knew how to spell. And because I don't have any duplicates, like I said, it's going to be really, really easy. I just need to grab this. I need to loop through this column. And because it's a bit easier to loop in an array, I'm going to do that. And then I also need a message. And then I can simply say for looper equals 1 to upper bound of my array, comma 1. Because it always likes adding that comma 1 when you load an array from a cell. My message should be equal to itself, and then a line break. And then the trouble here is that it's going to add a line break right at the start, which is ugly to look at. So I guess if I change this to be all weapons, then it doesn't matter that I have a line break right at the start, because it's totally on purpose. I definitely planned that. And then that should be my array, looper, comma 1. Finally, to print it. I get all weapons, absolute wall, BL for Josie, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not going to add in a sorting function because I'm just choosing to already sort my table, my original table, meaning I don't have to worry about that. So that was nice and simple. Getting the name of all weapons is only mildly more difficult. So if I go back and then I need to say show name of all weapons, I'm going to start out by saying again, I want all of these, but my array is then now equal to 2 columns. So if I grab this, yeah, that's fine. It should be weapon 1 and then weapon 2. And if we then run this, and my error here is that I'm trying to use a comma when really I should have been using a colon. So if I then press F8, I can now see my array. It's now been, and I have a 2-dimensional array with here CEO's tiers and fan beam, which is fine because I'll be making the message itself. So now I've loaded my array with all weapons, means I now have an array that goes from 1 to 23 and 1 to 2. And I then want to create another array which stores only weapon names as a variant. And then I also want a row count, spite. I then want to redim my weapon name array to be equal to 1 to the upper bound of my array, which is then way too big. Like I've said, if you have to redim preserve each time you add a row, it's going to be slower. So this is another method, and it's a better method. Here I'm making an assumption because this might actually be wrong. I'm saying here, I know that right now there are 23 collabs and there are 16 weapons, which means I know there are more collabs than there are weapons, which means this will leave me with an array that has some empty rows. And this is because you need 2 weapons to be combined into 1 collab. So I'm always going to have the number of collabs be equal to the number of weapons or have more collabs. And then I can say that row count should be equal to 1. And I then need actually more loopers. I don't just want looper, I want looper outer and I want looper inner. And just as I did up here, I need to do this check if I already have added the weapon because I now want to remove duplicates. And I'm in Excel 2016, so I don't have that fancy unique function. So I need to do it manually, which means I want to add more variables saying that already in array as boolean. Then I start out by saying already in array is equal to false. Then I'm looping again. And row count is going to increase every time I add a weapon to this new array that only has unique values. if my array looper outer, comma 1 equal to my weapon name array looper inner. And here I don't need that comma 1 because I'm not filling up the array from a range. Then I want to say already in array. And actually I want to add that to a new line because I also want to break the loop prematurely, because there's no point in continuing once I already know I've added the weapon. Then I should stop. And then I need that endif and indentation. So if I haven't already added the array, then I want to do something. So actually that is here. So now I know I haven't already added the weapon to my array, my final array. Then I can say if already in array is equal to false, then I haven't already added it, which means I do want to add it now. And it's kind of unnecessary to do this check because I know if already in array is true, then I break out early, but I want to do this more for clarity's sake. Should then be equal to the looper outer, comma 1, and then I want to increment row count with 1, and then break endif. I then need to repeat this again because I have two columns because of the way I've created my array, column 1 and column 2, which means I need to take this portion and repeat it, which means I can just copy this part, which means I need to check the other column. So here I check the first column, so weapon 1, and then I need to check weapon 2. So I'll be taking this portion and duplicating that, saying already in array, and then I need to make sure that's 2 and that's 2. So I could add that and say check column 1. And otherwise everything is the same. If I then print my weapon name array, then this gives me type, but that is not the message. Yeah, so I haven't filled up the message yet because this is simply the array. So I need to create my message, which I called message. Yeah. And right now, as I said, if I just run this, I will have my weapon name array and I will have some empty rows, which I don't want. So I can create my message by saying that right now message should be equal to blank. And then I'll say looper inner, just because I need a looper variable. And I could say do while weapon name array. And then that can be, that's the looper inner. And I don't need the comma 1 because I filled it up normally. Then I can say as long as this doesn't produce empty, which it will on row 17, then I can say that my message should be equal to, and actually I want to add text to that, to say just as I did up here, to say all weapons. Actually that is not all weapons, that's all collabs. Here is all weapons, colon, and then I can say message equals itself and a line break, and then I want the weapon name array, looper inner. Then I want to print my message. If I go back up here, type mismatch, I kind of need to actually do something with this because this doesn't return true because this isn't a condition. So I forgot to say that as long as this returns true, that is that weapon name array looper inner. So these values are different from nothing and something broke. So we can now see what message has become. All weapons bounce ball. That is because I created an infinite loop. So that makes perfect sense. And that's what happens when you do things live, because I'm actually deviating from my script. If I do this again, it will now work. And I do again have that extra line at the top, but I can live with that. And I could go in and do some sorting because I have whammy water, X potato, then glow stick, but I don't feel like doing that again. I can live with this, which only leaves one more array, and that's going to be a big one where I need to add another user form. So you can let that be a teaser. Yep.